Hello, everybody. Thanks very much for joining us for another Trade Justice Alliance Sunday webinar. Tonight's topic is trade wars, tariffs, and the Asia-Pacific region, and that includes China. And it's important in the global scheme of things, and also the ongoing militarization and threats of the region. There's a lot of confusion. I think we all understand that when it comes to the issues of trade and militarization, and we're going to be talking about a few of those issues this evening. Our guest speakers tonight are Celeste Drake, Trade and Globalization Specialist with the AFL-CIO, Arnie Saiki, Coordinator with the Moana Nui Action Alliance. He is also a researcher for Statehood Hawaii and a blogger for Imapono Projects. Also, we'll hear from Jan Weinberg. He is the founder of the group Show Up America, and they're a group that focuses on civic engagement methodology. Okay, before we get underway tonight, we would like to honor the memory of the great anti-TPP activist, Zahara Heckscher. You might remember she was a guest speaker on our webinars a few years ago. She was a hero for affordable medicines, and she was a great fighter against the Trans-Pacific Partnership, especially around what we call the death sentence clause, and that is the patent protections that extend monopolies on medications. That would mean a death sentence to persons like herself who need the medications for survival. We met Zahara in Atlanta at the last TPP protest there, and she spoke on our webinar, and that was in 2015. She died February 24th from breast cancer. She was 53 years old. Oops. We also lost another great TPP fighter, and that is Louise Slaughter. She was a representative for New York's 25th Congressional District. She was always an advocate for women, and she had this to say on International Women's Day shortly after the TPP was released. She said, "This year's theme, Pledge for Parity, is a call that we should all rally around. Our pledge to support women across the world should include the promise to oppose the Trans-Pacific Partnership. She will be missed by all of us free trade fighters." Now tonight, I would also like to make sure that everyone knows that we support the March for Our Lives campaign, and that we don't allow also a teaching moment to be swept under the rug. In our education about the connections between trade and militarization, we wanted to say a couple words about the connection between gun violence in our society and the acceptance and the promotion of the military-industrial complex at home and abroad. The United States government, and that is through our own taxes, has approximately 800 military bases in countries around the world, and there are several hundred of these bases located in the Asia-Pacific region. The purpose, as we probably all understand, is to support corporations in the fight for natural resources of this area, and of course to support the weapons industry. We can't leave that out of it. As part of the recent deal to keep the government open, Congress increased the fiscal year 2018 defense budget to $700 billion, and that's an increase of $108 billion, or 18%. And that's above the proposed 2017 budget. And in the fiscal year 2019 budget, they expect to increase it to $716 billion. Since Trump has taken office, the defense budget, it will have grown by $133 billion, or by 23%. It's impossible to ignore the connections between gun violence in our society and militarization and trade, because schools like Parkland have become the recruiting grounds for the military industry. Nicholas Cruz was not only a member of the Junior Reserve Officer Training Program, he was also a member of an NRA proxy program called the Civilian Marksmanship Program, or CMP. He was recruited and trained by the Army in his school. He attended the programs beginning at the age of 14, and he learned to shoot military-style air guns. Through the Junior ROTC, our children, especially minorities and disadvantaged students, are taught to hold guns and shoot at a very young age. And in some states, as in my own state of Florida, schools in disadvantaged areas particularly allow students who take the Junior ROTC to substitute biology, physical ed, science, PE, and art for this military program. Nicholas Cruz had on his Junior ROTC shirt when he was arrested. He was trained to shoot by ex-military, and the shooting program was funded by the NRA. We support the students in their campaign to end gun violence in America. They are the future that hopefully leads to a peaceful planet. This is a huge issue, and it is obviously beyond the scope of this webinar. To learn more about this, go to studentprivacy.org. I will quickly run through some technical applications now. So if you want to get into the online meeting room for visuals, go to tradejustice.net/room. You can visit our website at tradejustice.net and our Facebook group called Trade Justice Alliance. Audio is through phone lines, but there is a link for audio through your computer. You can just click the free conference call hd.com/dialer and punch in the dial-in number and code into the dialer. The meeting room is courtesy of People Demanding Action. Andrea Miller is the Executive Director. We have only one rule for our chat box, everybody. Please be respectful of our speakers and our attendees. And last but not least, if you would like to opt in to future text reminders for our webinars, approximately 2 hours before the webinars, just text from your mobile phone in all caps, webinar reminder, to 917-791-1131. And I would now like to introduce our good friend Celeste Drake. She is the first speaker tonight. Celeste is a trade and globalization policy specialist at the AFL-CIO. She works to improve U.S. trade policy so it doesn't send more jobs overseas, and to improve labor rights for workers overseas so that workers globally can race to the top instead of having global corporations push us to the bottom. Celeste earned a Bachelor of Arts, a JD, and an MPP from UCLA. Welcome, Celeste.
Hi, happy to be here. Can you hear me okay?
Yep, you sound great.
Okay, great, thank you. Please excuse me if I cough at all. I'll try to mute myself ahead of time, but I'm still trying to get rid of a cold that I've had for far too long. Next slide, please. Okay, so I'm really just going to kind of give an overview, a little bit of Econ 101, TPP 101, Tariffs 101, just to set the stage, and hopefully that'll be enough to answer some questions and give you some more questions and lead the way for the other speakers to follow. So first I'm going to talk about the TPP a little bit, and the reason why is that the remaining countries in the TPP, for those who've been on this call for a while, you know that this group was very involved in educating about and fighting the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which was a 12-country trade agreement. And we happened to be so effective, in fact, that we really killed it in Congress. And then when President Trump came in, he really saw the popularity of the anti-TPP position and went ahead and withdrew the U.S., but it was really dead in terms of the U.S. anyway. But the 11 other countries went ahead and made it official did the sign-off this week. So not all of them have completed their ratification processes, but it's theoretically able to be enforced now as soon as enough countries ratify. So the main thing that I want to say is that the TPP is not really about trade, just like the NAFTA is not really about trade, and all of the other trade agreements that the U.S. has been involved in since NAFTA are not really about trade. They're about a lot of things, particularly putting a straitjacket around our economy and limiting the ways that we can run it and that our trading partners can run their economies. But trade is sort of what you see here. It's people exchanging goods in a marketplace. And if the TPP or any of these other deals were really just about that, they really wouldn't be so controversial. So that's the first thing to just keep in mind. No matter what they're called, they're not about trade. Next slide, please. So what is TPP about? Well, it's about corporate rights and enshrining them into international economic law. For the U.S., it's really about outsourcing. So it makes it easier for global companies to produce in places where they don't respect labor and human rights, where they have lower environmental standards, where occasionally they can get more subsidies from the governments, lower taxes from the governments, and essentially pitch countries against each other in this competition to get the investment of the global companies. Now, under the Obama administration, they talked about TPP being a security deal, and somehow it was going to encircle China or make us trade better against China or set American standards instead of Chinese standards in the Asia-Pacific. And that all really wasn't, there was nothing in the TPP specifically that had anything to do with the military or security, even though it was really talked about that way. And when you would talk to the folks who were working on it in the Obama administration and say just exactly how is this going to make us, quote unquote, safer, they of course couldn't answer it because it really didn't have a lot to do with that. That was really kind of bringing up the fears of China as a way to get the TPP ahead. So it gives corporations more rights than they would have. Again, the supporters claim it will help parties deal better with China, but there's nothing in it that really does that. In fact, the rules of origin are so loose that things that are made in China that are not consistent with the TPP standards, so maybe they're not consistent with TPP's labor standards or TPP's environmental standards or whatever it is, those can go right into TPP goods that are then further processed in Malaysia or Australia or New Zealand or Peru and become TPP products. So there's really nothing, it is talked about as this almost anti-China thing, but in reality it doesn't really do anything to help parties, quote unquote, compete better with China. And some of its worst provisions are the investor-state dispute settlement, the rules around the medicines that would make medicines more expensive because it favors the brand name pharmaceuticals, what they call TBT or technical barriers to trade, and a whole host of rules that are essentially deregulatory, and also the labor and environmental rules that were highly touted by the Obama administration, but for folks who have been on these calls for a long time, no, they wouldn't really work. Next slide, please. So what will it, for those countries that are still in it, it will certainly increase corporate power over and above where it already is for the member parties because, again, it puts them into this greater competition for the foreign investment. And so that means what the countries are doing is trying to increase the returns to capital so that they get the investment. And the best ways that you increase returns to capital is by lowering your taxes and lowering your labor costs. And if you do those things, capital says, aha, we've got a higher profit rate if we invest here over here, and that's how you get that. It's also likely to displace workers just because that's the nature of what trade agreements do. They really are designed purposefully to change production patterns so that the production goes to where it's, quote unquote, more efficient in economic terms. So it's designed, you know, ahead of time, some workers will be put out of work. And in a lot of these countries that we trade with, when you displace workers and you don't have a safety net program and you don't have anything that guarantees them a good place to go to get the same or a better job, what you end up with is more migration. That's an economic push factor. And if you don't protect the migrants as they move from country to country, just seeking to survive, then you've got more vulnerable people that are likely to go into the system and be exploited. And you can see that's what's happened in the U.S., for example, under CAFTA. The Central American Free Trade Agreement displaced a lot of workers in Central America because trade with the United States pushed out what they were doing and made it less economically efficient, and there was really no place for them to go. When we look at the history of what similar trade agreements have done, they tend to suppress wages, they tend to increase inequality, they tend to suppress union power, they tend to degrade the environment, they tend to enhance corporate concentration because the already big and powerful countries get bigger and powerful, and they come in and displace smaller local companies, particularly in developing countries. And it's also going to spur this whole host of sort of Me Too agreements, and you see that if you're following this, the Pacific Alliance Agreement, which involves Mexico, Colombia, now Canada, a whole bunch of countries, they're trying to firm that up. There's a new Canada-Mercosur agreement in the works. So everyone's just trying to do more and more TPP-like agreements. Next slide. So some people want to know, why is it now called the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership? What's different about it than when the U.S. was a member? Well, the one thing that's different is it's 11 countries instead of 12 countries. The 11 remaining countries did change some of the intellectual property rules that were particularly unpopular. So in terms of medicines, market exclusivity provisions, which are an enhanced IP protection beyond patent, those were taken out. Some of the patent rules were taken out. So automatic patent extensions if there's a delay in granting a patent, or the requirement to patent a new use of an old drug. Those were taken out. Those are actually good things that they were taken out. Also taken out were some of the copyright rules, like putting liability on internet service providers and requiring that parties create criminal provisions for violations of digital rights management. So most of the changes were regarding intellectual property. There was one place where they deleted an expansion of ISDS, but other than that, there really is nothing different, and the whole framework, the pro-corporate framework, is still there. It's not progressive. Why is it called progressive? It's basically to make the deal more palatable. And why? Because progressives were amongst the leading folks fighting the TPP and making it unpalatable. So in Canada, this liberal, what's called the Liberal Party, which is in power now, and that's really the center party of the three main Canadian parties, they like to use the term progressive because it makes them sound like they're being really responsive to these things. So really that's why it's a marketing ploy rather than it being a progressive model deal. So next slide, please. So I've kind of already made this point, but for folks who are interested, the CPTPP, it's one of a series of similar deals. They are not advanced at the behest of working people or for the benefit of working people. Occasionally, some working people might benefit from it if they get a new job in an up-and-coming industry, whether that's in the U.S. or whether that's a country that we trade with. And that's great, but that's sort of happenstance. What it's really about is corporate power. And they all follow an economic model that is called liberal, and not liberal in the American sense of on the left of the spectrum, but economically liberal, meaning open markets. Neoliberal, and some people might know the term Washington Consensus, all of that describes these type of deals. Next slide, please. Okay, and these are just sort of the things that this neoliberal or Washington Consensus school of thought promotes. And there are lots of ways that these ideas are forced upon the world, particularly through the World Bank and the IMF on developing countries, but they are forced upon as a sort of straitjacket on developed countries through these trade agreements. So this school of thought promotes a very small public sector, lots of privatization, and you see that promoted through these trade deals through the trade and services provisions and something called the ratchet clause. So if you open a public sector to a private competitor, think about private prisons in the U.S., then that's stuck forever by something in a trade agreement known as a ratchet clause. So they promote deregulation. How do they do that? Similarly, through this ratchet clause, as if you deregulate something, you can't later re-regulate it unless you pay for that by deregulating something else in the trade agreement. Standstill essentially locks in the regulations that you have, meaning go no further, on what I call policy boxes, which are a whole host of rules that say these are the ways in which you can regulate, and if you try to regulate outside of that list, you're risking a trade challenge. So it essentially puts your policy in a box. This school of thought promotes low taxation. It promotes quote-unquote labor market flexibilities, which means it's harder to form a union, it's easier to fire people, and you want to have a weak safety net because you want those workers desperate to go take any job they can, even if it's a bad job. Because if they have a good safety net, they might actually wait around for a good job. And finally, free flow of capital, meaning the money can transfer between countries wherever it wants to go freely. And if you try and slow it down because you're having a domestic crisis in your own economy and you're trying to stop a crash, that's likely to be a trade violation. You notice what's missing is free flow of people. You can make the money go, but not necessarily the people. Next slide, please. So what we have lived in this experience is that this economic model tends to enrich global companies, largely U.S.-based companies, but also, some of the biggest companies in the world are Japanese, European, some now Chinese. The richest man in the world is Carlos Slim of Mexico, who made his money post-NAFTA. Oftentimes, it locks developing countries into commodity-based economies, which are really vulnerable. Commodities really go up and down in price, and it doesn't allow you to really grow the economy for your people the way you want. And it locks that in because it prevents these countries from doing a lot of the things that the U.S. did and other countries did when they were trying to grow. So it locks their tariffs in lower so they can't protect infant industry. It prevents them from reserving their government purchases to their own companies. It often prevents them from putting what are called performance requirements on companies so that companies who invest there have to reinvest into that country. That goes back to that free flow of capital. They're free to take all their profits elsewhere. This economic model is not what helped Singapore, China, and Korea grow into economic powerhouses. They each tweaked the model and used it differently, and particularly China. They have an economic model that's often called neo-mercantilist or state-run capitalism. But in other words, they said, thanks for your advice, Western countries. We're going to kind of do things our own way. And they've done better than the countries that have really adopted this model. And it just promotes inequality. And if you want to read more about how the model really does that, there's an article called Trading Down about the TPP. It's a little wonky, but it really explains that methodology pretty clearly. Next slide, please. So these are just some visuals to show you what has happened. And you can see for the United States, since the Federal Reserve Bank has been keeping track, workers' national share of income is way, way down. And you can see it, tended to bounce around a lot until we got into this era of neoliberalism and Washington consensus. And then you see that although it still bounces, the trend has been down. And that is something that's repeated in Canada. It's repeated in Mexico. It's repeated in Germany. It's actually repeated in Korea. It's a worldwide trend because all the countries in the world are participating in this neoliberal form of trade. Next slide, please. Okay, here's another one that gives you the U.S. trend, but also the comparative trend. You can see that trade union density is going down. And it's not solely, right, since NAFTA or since China joined the WTO, but it's a trend as the economy's changed from a demand-based model, a Keynesian model, to this more neoliberal model, and it's happening across different sectors. And when you have fewer union members, you have weaker unions. They're less able to negotiate middle-class wages, and then you have the wage stagnation that you see in the other slides. Next slide, please. Okay, this is just another way of showing wage stagnation. What you see is the productivity of workers keeps increasing, and you see that wages are not increasing with it. Now, that's a function of not having the unions to negotiate good deals. It also means that that triangle shape that's captured between the wages and the productivity, that's being captured by the employers. So profits are going up. The system is working for someone. It's just not average people. And this chart, again, I've seen it replicated almost exactly for Canada and for other countries. It's really the flip side of that chart where you see the worker share of national income going down. Next slide, please. And then specific to the U.S., we see that the U.S. trade deficit and this chart shows since 92, and NAFTA went into force from 95, the U.S. has been running a pretty small trade deficit since about the mid-70s. And then as the U.S. really started hitting hard, NAFTA, WTO, lots of these free trade agreements, and really committing to this neoliberal model, for the U.S., which had been for many years kind of the manufacturer to the world, became the consumer to the world, and our trade deficits started really blowing up. And where you see the trade deficit got better was really the height of the recession, so nobody was buying anything. So that's why you see that it got better. It wasn't actually a sign of everything in our economy getting better. It was just that demand halted, and demand actually halted around the world because it was really a global decline. Next slide, please. Now, the trade deficit is not the only thing that matters here, and you've seen that by all the different charts that I've shown, but it does matter to some extent. And why does it matter? Well, for one, it makes our GDP smaller. So in other words, it's a drag on our economic growth for the U.S. economy. And the gross domestic product is all of consumption, which is about 70% of the U.S. economy, that's the C, plus investment, so how much are we investing to make our economy grow further, plus, government purchases, and the U.S. has the biggest government purchasing sector in the world, plus X for exports minus M for imports. So for the U.S., that X minus M is a negative number and has been a negative number for most years since, 1976. So that just means our GDP is smaller than it otherwise would be. That means there are fewer jobs than we otherwise would have. So it's not really a link to the unemployment rate, which is a different number, but it's a link to how many jobs and good jobs would we have in the economy. Because when someone loses a job to trade, usually they get another job. It's just that job usually pays a lot less. And then some people permanently drop out of the labor market, and then they're not measured at all in terms of unemployment. So when we have more imports than exports, we have to pay for those goods by selling one of two things. Either our assets, like buildings, factories, land, that's sort of past production, or going into debt, and that's future production. But it's not equaling our current production, so we really can trade past production or future production for it. And if you look at the housing bubble and the great financial crisis, in part that was because we have such a huge deficit and China holds so much of it. You had all these dollars held by China and other countries looking for greater returns. You know, at some point these dollars become dissatisfied with just buying U.S. government debt, which is a pretty standard return but minimal. So they were looking for how do we get greater returns on all these giant piles of dollars we have sitting around. So they kept chasing these creative and exotic new things that Wall Street was putting out, and they kept chasing property values. And you saw them go higher and higher and higher and push the bubble, and it eventually crashed. So traditional economics says that deficits can't last 40 years like the U.S. has had. So it's just sort of counter. Traditional economics says if a country has a large deficit, its currency will decline in value. It will make exports more attractive, and it will eventually get back to import. And folks, you know, we're saying that about the U.S. deficit sort of the first 10 years, the first 20 years, and now traditional economists are they don't know what to say. So instead they just say, well, the deficit doesn't matter. Next slide, please. So what contributes to the deficit? So I talked about some of it on the last slide. I'll talk about it some more. So one is the U.S. doesn't have an industrial policy. We just don't really care so much about our domestic policy because we've gone to this quote-unquote free market neoliberal. So we don't really invest in how do we take that new innovation and become the world leaders in producing it. We don't really link up what we're teaching our students with training or education, including vocational schools, with real jobs and new industries and making sure we get those. So currency imbalances. So folks have probably heard a lot about China manipulating its currency sort of for the first 15 years of this century. But that's also on the U.S. The U.S. has an overvalued currency and hasn't done anything about it, largely because Wall Street profits when there's a strong dollar. So the imbalances in the currency, there's a lot of blame to go around. Trade deals that promote offshoring without helping to ensure that the working people can share in the benefits. So it's great that the U.S. sells a lot of agricultural products to the Central American countries. But it's not great that small farmers and campesinos there that have been pushed off the land aren't making middle-class wages so that they can buy other products. And so we're not really helping build a middle class abroad, and that reduces global demand. There are foreign trade practices that when some countries engage in them and other countries don't, what you have is a little bit of unfair and unbalanced trade. So China in particular has engaged in subsidies, IP theft, and overcapacity. And then, of course, U.S. tax policies actually promote disinvestment in the U.S., and they promote offshoring. So there's not one country that's at fault here, but we can look to our own government, and our own government could fix a lot of this. So we don't necessarily need to blame other countries, even though, you know, their practices contribute to it as well. Next slide, please. So what the Trump administration, is doing now because of these sort of trade imbalances and getting focused on it is saying, well, we're going to put tariffs on China. And anyone that's ever taken a Econ 101 class might recognize this chart, and I won't go over the whole thing. I just put it there because it might trigger sort of bad memories of taking Econ 101 in college. So what it shows you, though, if you just look at the price, the world price, so that's when you have your domestic supply and you import, you have a world supply. The PW, that's the price that the good would normally be. PT, that's when you put on a tariff, which reduces the imports. The price actually is higher, and the quantity that you import, if you look at the Q, QT is lower than Q1, PT is higher than PW. So you're increasing the price, you're decreasing the quantity imported. Economically, it's less efficient. And it's easy to say, well, who wants to pay a higher price? Or why would we want to have a smaller supply? That economically is called inefficient. There's something called deadweight loss, and that's what that is. So next slide, please. But the U.S. has tried, well, let's educate people. If we just send more kids to college, that'll fix our economy. If we just rely on innovation, meaning creativity and inventions, that'll fix our economy. If we just do more free trade, the problem is that our trade is not free enough. They've tried lecturing partners, like literally the Bush administration, the Obama administration went to China and said, look, if we just explain to them if they follow our economic model instead of theirs, they'll be better off. And these countries are actually smart enough to go, wait a minute, we're actually seem to be doing pretty well as it is. So why should we adopt your model? And then, of course, diplomacy. Well, if we just talk at them some more, send them a sternly worded letter, things will change. And so all of these things, you know, they don't really change. In the end, they don't necessarily create jobs or raise wages here in this country, so they haven't worked. Next slide, please. And just to give you a sense of what's happening because of the trade deficit, we have, according to the Department of Labor, this is how many workers each year lost their jobs due to trade. And this is typically an underestimate because many of the workers who lose their jobs due to trade either don't even know they can apply or they can't demonstrate that the job was lost due to trade. So you can imagine that this is these are underestimates of the real numbers. And every one of those numbers, that's a family. That's somebody that now has a question of, can I pay my rent this month? Can I put food on the table for my kids? Next slide, please. So this administration has decided to try tariffs because they try, you know, all those other things that are supposed to work have been tried and haven't really worked. Tariffs are a normal part of international trade. So there was a study over the decade between 1995 and 2004 just counting anti-dumping tariffs, which is one form of tariffs. There were over 1,600 imposed in the world, including almost the same amount by the U.S. and EU, roughly 200 in each case, and India 302. And President Obama put steel tariffs on 9 countries, ranging all the way up to 118%. So it's pretty typical to put in tariffs. So why we've got Wall Street running around like Chicken Little and saying the sky is falling seems to be a little bit hypocritical because they put up with it in the past with other presidents. Next slide, please. So is the sky falling? From our perspective, no. We would say trade enforcement is not the same as a trade war. Trade enforcement is a normal part of trade. The tariffs are an important first step to try and address the global glut in steel and aluminum markets. But they are going to be most effective if, A, they're viewed as a tool to achieve something down the road and not an end in and of themselves. If the U.S. doesn't go it alone and say, we're the U.S., we're going to tell the world what to do, but rather it gets involved with allies to say, how do we address these problems which we all face? How do we all multilaterally address these problems rather than unilaterally? So, and frankly, for this administration, just because they put tariffs and just because the AFL-CIO says, yeah, these tariffs are okay, that doesn't mean this administration has a great trade policy. That's one tiny piece of trade policy, and trade policy has to go back and fix all of our trade agreements, which I talked about at the beginning of my talk, how they are all really pro-corporate and how they really leave workers behind. So this is one slice of a comprehensive trade reform. Next slide, please. So do these actions make Trump progressive? Certainly not, right? And his policies aren't progressive, and they're not really traditionally populist. They're sort of this weird combination of partially nationalistic, xenophobic, isolationist, partly corporatist, you know, and there may be places where some of the traditional populism, has a little Venn diagram with some traditional progressivism just on the fact that you get more active in trade rather than leave it to neoliberal. But that doesn't mean he's got any elements of a progressive in there. The USTR, Robert Lighthizer, who's a longtime trade attorney, he has incorporated some fair trade ideas into his proposals for NAFTA, for example, but also lots of pro-corporate policies that we don't like. So we do like his ISDS rules and his idea for a performance review, that trade agreements are not forever, but have to be reviewed. He's put bad proposals down for medicines, for banking regulations, for privacy, all the things that corporations would want. What's he going to do on labor chapters? Still unknown. And then all of that needs to be taken with the background of Trump's domestic labor policy. He puts people who are enemies to labor in charge of the National Labor Relations Board, the Mining Safety and Health Administration, in charge of the Department of Labor. He's trying to undo overtime rules from the Obama administration. He's undone a lot of the safe workplaces rules that are administered by the Mining Safety and Health Administration and the Occupational Safety and Health Administration. They've got a proposal that would essentially allow employers to steal tips from workers. He's tried to block disclosure rules so we could see how much people get paid to make sure they're paid fairly. He supports right to work. All of those things are heavily anti-progressive and anti-labor. Next slide, please. So in our view, good policy is good policy, and it shouldn't be partisan. We need to make clear that working families are better off with effective international rules, not a go-it-alone strategy. The problem is we don't really have effective international rules right now. Whether it's the WTO, NAFTA, or TPP, they're all really pro-corporate, and none of them are really pro-working people. So we need international rules, but not the rules we currently have. So we can applaud anything that's on our agenda. It doesn't mean we're applauding the president. So when we say, wow, the United Steelworkers have been pushing for a decade to get some action on steel overcapacity, it's good that we have action on steel overcapacity. That's not the same as saying, labor is endorsing President Trump. But where there are overlaps, we need to be clear about what our benchmarks are and what we stand for, and that we're not standing for a person or a party. We're standing for our progressive agenda. So that means distinguish our values. Our values are not nationalism and xenophobia. Our values are labor protections for everyone, a sustainable environment for everyone, that we can't rise if others are being held down. All of those things, and we need to be clear about it. So I believe that is my last slide.
Thank you very much, Celeste. And so now if you have a question for Celeste, if you would please press *6 and then the 1 when you're prompted. That will put you into the queue, and Carrie will open the queue up for your questions. So press *6 on your phone. That was such a good presentation.
Oh, thank you.
Yep. Okay, let's see.
No questions yet.
Nobody has a question for Celeste?
Okay.
Oh, here we go. All right, you're ready?
Yep.
Wireless caller at area code 240. Your line is open. Hello?
Maybe it's Wendy. Is that Wendy?
No, Wendy's the next one. Wireless caller at area code 240.
I'm sorry, I was on mute.
There you are. There you are.
There we go. Hi, my name is Chuck Woolery. I'm in Rockville, Maryland, and I'm really overwhelmed with the depth of this presentation. I'm way over my head on trade issues. I work a lot on the Sustainable Development Goals and also linking trade to national security regarding dual-use technologies. Is there anything you have to say regarding either of those particular issues?
I will say on the Sustainable Development Goals, they are not well tied to trade policy and what's actually in trade agreements. So they're really treated as a, almost as a standalone. And I went to the UN Conference on Trade and Development in the summer of 2016, and there was a lot of talk there about the Sustainable Development Goals, but there wasn't a lot of talk about how, one of the best ways to promote them, which is promoting trade unions internationally. And there was really no discussion about how you would achieve them through enforceable trade agreements. And on the dual-use technologies, that's not really my area of expertise, but certainly, part of what the AFL-CIO talks about is the fact that, countries shouldn't be, if they have something that they believe is vital to their national security, and that's in the view of whatever country is making the decision, they ought to be able to say, that's not something we're going to trade and therefore risk our national security. And there's actually some rules in the World Trade Organization, for instance, that undermine that in some instances, particularly if what you're talking about is a commodity, so which is different than probably the high-tech stuff you're talking about. But the WTO says you don't really have a right to keep it for yourself. You have to trade what you have. And that's, when you think about that, that's so far away from what most people would think a sovereign country would be able to do. So I just think countries should be able to be careful about what it is that they want to trade. And if that means not trading particular goods because they think it's vital to their national security, that seems like a choice countries ought to be able to make.
Thank you.
Thank you, Celeste. Okay, our next question comes from Wendy. Your line is open. Wendy, I heard clicking. Did you mute yourself?
Alrighty, I'll check in. Oh, there we go. Hello, fantastic presentation. I'll tie in two questions, I guess along the same lines as the previous caller. If you could tie in the recent addition of John Bolton. And my other question is, Trump did file for the Trade Promotion Authority. So maybe an update on that as well. Thank you.
Yeah, really good question. So, again, the AFL-CIO doesn't really, get involved in all foreign policy issues, and certainly if we do, I don't know if the AFL-CIO has a position on John Bolton. He's somebody that I personally would not have recommended for this position based on what he did during the Bush administration. So, I can't imagine how that would spin in a way that's good for working people. So I'll just leave it at that. And then with respect to Trade Promotion Authority, I guess the question is what, how the labor movement and our allies in the environmental movement and others will work together regarding the extension of Trade Promotion Authority. That's really the question, because we all unilaterally opposed the fast-track bill that went through, and but what happens is typically it's the first 3 years is guaranteed, and then the second 3 years there's never been an instance where Congress has effectively voted to stop it. But it's an interesting time where I think everyone's not really clear. All of the interested parties haven't really gotten together and developed a strategy and figured out, is there a way to, at this point, put in what we would want in a Trade Promotion Authority, so to stop the one that we don't like from being extended for 3 years and go for something better. Because our goal, again, it's not to stop all trade. It's not to build walls around the U.S., but it is to do trade on a progressive agenda, a different agenda. And part of the way that you do that is you have different rules around Trade Promotion Authority and how trade agreements are negotiated, primarily making them much more public and open and democratic and transparent. So I think your question I don't quite have an answer to, but I would say be involved in whatever groups you're involved in. If you have an opinion, make that known to your member of Congress and your senators, and, you know, be a part of your groups and saying how you think the progressive movement should respond to this, because I'm not sure that I've heard really a consistent idea yet, or that anyone has an idea that thinks will work to reform Trade Promotion Authority at this time, given the Congress and the president that we have.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Celeste. Our next question comes from Alan. Your line is open.
Thank you. That was a great presentation, Celeste. I'm just wondering if AFL-CIO has anything that it's planning to do for World Health Day on April 7th.
Not that I'm aware of, but there might be others who work on, you know, the international team who have something planned. When is World Health Day?
April 7th.
April 10th.
April 7th.
I'll have to ask my colleagues, because there's not anything that I'm aware of, but that doesn't necessarily mean there's not anything at all. So,
I'm just wondering if I could send you an email asking if we could get a network of contact set up so that there's a support base for Goal 3 of the SDGs. Because that, sure, I think, is the way to, you know, I think if we could get that rolling, we could get the best prices and the best technologies put together so we could actually have a very economical pharmacare program.
Yeah. I mean, send me what you've got. You know, our problem, often the things that we don't get involved with, it's really not that we're not interested. It's that, you know, there's only so many hours in a day. And it's usually a manpower problem rather than a disinterest problem. But please send me whatever you have.
Oh, thanks very much. Will do.
Okay.
Thanks, Alan.
We have one more question in the queue. Caller at area code 415. Your line is open.
Okay. Well, the primary thing that has promoted the Made in USA is the lowering of the value of the U.S. dollar, and a secondary thing is taxes on imported goods. You know, we always charge federal income taxes and corporate taxes for Made in USA goods, but tariff taxes have been used in previous years when the U.S. had a trade surplus or balanced trade. Today, comparing the two, which will bring revenue to the U.S. federal government, the lowering of the value of the U.S. dollar or import taxes?
Wow. I'm not sure I know the answer to that one. I can tell you that import taxes used to be the primary income for the federal government, and that was true for many, many years. You know, more than the first 100 years of the existence of the country. And when you drop tariffs and you get them as low as what the U.S.'s are, so the U.S. average tariff applied internationally is about 2%. It's not a major source of revenue. It is a source of revenue, but it's not a major one anymore, and it's not been for a long time. Now, in terms of our imports, it's actually the case that the dollar has a very high value because it's the world's reserve currency, and the U.S. has not done a lot to lower the value, and that's actually a barrier to selling our exports globally, because it means goods made in the U.S. under the dollar are quite expensive, whereas the goods that we want to import are pretty cheap. And what folks are talking about, I think, in terms of a progressive reform is not really building up tariff walls and having lots and lots of tariffs, but we could do things about how we tax companies. And there are lots of proposals around, for instance, market access charges, so that we're actually taxing those who buy U.S. government debt or engage in currency transactions. So if you put a minuscule tax on each one of those, that could make a difference. Similar to the way they talk about a financial transactions tax. You put a minuscule tax and you can create a lot of money and potentially discourage some bad trades. You can potentially tax global corporations by where they're selling the products, in other words, where they're making their profits, versus letting them freely assign tax jurisdictions by who lets them play the most games and avoid the most taxes. So I don't have like all the specifics on all of that, but we do need to think about how the U.S. government gets adequate revenue to invest in our own people. And, you know, with the Republican tax bill, that's really in question. Most people think the next thing that's coming as a result of that bill are proposals to heavily cut Social Security, Medicare, lots of other important federal programs. And we have to think about how to get taxes in a way that doesn't harm average working families, but also, given the freedom that companies have to move around and avoid taxes, what you really need is international cooperation, where all of the countries say, we're going to stop allowing the game playing, and we're all going to say, look, we get to tax you guys. You guys, you know, produce economic activity globally, and we're all going to tax it. And right now that's not happening. So you get these agreements to trade more, but no agreements on how you're going to tax the economic activity that you're creating. And so you allow these companies to really enrich themselves, and in many cases it's at the cost of the citizens, whether they're in a developing country or a developed country. So I'm sorry it wasn't more specific to what your question was, but that's a little beyond what I've got right now.
Obviously, I know the answer, but here's the second question. Which lowers the cost for foreign investors to buy U.S. assets such as U.S. real estate, a lowering of the value of the U.S. dollar, or import taxes?
Well, there are no import taxes on buying. When you make an investment in a country, that's not really an import or an export. That's an investment. So that's not taxed in that, you know, through tariffs at all.
See, well, obviously the lowering of the value of the U.S. dollar means that real estate, buying U.S. assets such as real estate, would be less of a cost for them.
But that's not really a problem. I understand that. That's not really the problem that the U.S. has. The U.S. has, because of our giant trade deficit, lots and lots of foreign investment, and it's actually in some markets one of the things that is driving up housing prices, because we have so much foreign investment in housing. And if you look at, for instance, the market for real estate in Manhattan and why housing there is so out of control, lots of the units are owned by foreign investors who don't live there and come there at certain times. So it's a little beyond the scope of what we're talking about here, but that is not really, when we have a deficit the size that we do, what that means when you're selling your past production and your assets, that means you're getting more foreign investment in, and we've got that now in the United States. And the question around that is, should we have more screens on foreign investment? Are we doing a good job of making sure that everything's bought to make the U.S. more productive? Or in some cases, are things being bought in order to take all the value and extract it somewhere else? So these are a lot of questions that we have.
Thank you very much, Celeste. You've been very gracious, and we always love it when you come on. And we really look forward to hearing from you in the future. Take it easy, and if you're able to stick with us, we'd love to have you. So we've got to move on now. Thank you so much. All right. I would like to now introduce our next speaker, Arnie Saiki. Arnie Saiki was a coordinator for the Moana Nui conferences beginning in 2011, a partnership between the International Forum on Globalization and Pua Mohala I Kapo. I probably didn't say that right. He has been campaigning on issues around trade, development, and militarization in the Pacific region ever since. Arnie was research director for Statehood Hawaii and Imipono Projects, which received a 2008 We the People National Endowment for the Humanities grant for his research, presentation, and program, Statehood and Hawaii, correspondences between the State Department, Congress, and the United Nations. Other presentations and programs that he has organized include Impact of Immigration on Hawaii's Past, Present, and Future, International Roots, Deoccupation, Decolonization, and the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, History of Hawaiian Political Activism from 1887 to present, Recovering Our Political Past While Probing Toward the Future, Ho'opunupuni, I'm not saying that right, The Myth of Statehood, and many short programs related to issues of statehood and colonization in Hawaii and in the Pacific. Currently, Arnie is participating in a working group on data, statistics, and valuation in the Pacific. His piece, TPP at the End of the Line, a briefing on economic cooperation and capacity building, was published last September in American Quarterly by Johns Hopkins University Press. Welcome, Arnie.
Hi. Can you hear me?
Yep, you sound great.
Oh, great. Well, thank you for inviting me to speak.
You're welcome.
That was a great introduction. Well, first I want to thank Celeste for her brilliant presentation. I think this presentation will follow hers in a surprisingly logical way. In case anyone was wondering, this is a graphic of shipping density that was created by the Department of Global Studies at Hofstra University. So for me, context is really important. And I think this map reveals something about our geopolitical assumptions when we think about trade, and that is transport and access. The last time I was invited to be on call, I spoke about BRICS and the TPP and the intersection between trade and militarization. And the narrative at that time was that the Obama administration was undermining the potential for BRICS, the Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa cooperation. Since that call, both Brazil and South Africa have undergone U.S.-backed regime change of their democratically elected presidents from these sort of trumped-up corruption charges. This administration has also been heavily courting India's Prime Minister Modi to participate in the Quad, a containment policy involving Australia, Japan, and the U.S., and it now promoting a platform that seeks to literally co-opt the China-led Belt and Road Initiative. And while this is all happening, both China and Russia are being painted as autocratic villains and cheaters, despite their tremendous popularity at home and among the non-aligned countries. And even though Trump pulled the U.S. out of the TPP, the military and containment agenda is still very present. And so before I talk about the Belt and Road, I do want to quickly reframe the backstory, which is important in order for us to understand the context. Next slide, please. So after what I generically call the 2008 financial collapse of the neoliberal system, the U.S., EU, Japan, and most of the other advanced economies had a rude awakening, namely that Wall Street's debt and investment paradigm across all sectors had collapsed and a government bailout was necessary to revive the economy. By 2010, it became apparent that although there was an impact on the emerging economies, for the most part, the state ownership system of the BRICS economies were still viable and seemingly quite sustainable. I think for the U.S., the failures of neoliberalism is one of too much debt and not enough equity. And if we were living in the immediate post-perestroika world of the Clinton-Bush era, where there was only one viable economic power, or what I prefer to call a unipolar system, then too much debt and not enough equity would simply be the only system. However, that paradigm is as fantastical as Donald Duck, and as much as we wish we could hold these Disney-fied half-truths to be self-evident, the whole truth is very different. Next slide, please. So these three charts tell a different story about our national economy, one that I think is maybe a bit more realistic than the overly optimistic numbers that Wall Street provides. And I think in many ways it's sort of a good continuation from where Celeste left off. But Chart A measures our public debt to GDP. And I want to highlight the period of growth after the collapse of the Soviet Union and after the Washington Consensus that gave us that neoliberal doctrine in 1989. And that is the vertical blue line. And then the 2008 financial collapse, which is the vertical red line. For the advanced economies, the prudent debt limit is 60% debt to GDP with a threshold limit of 90%. Where we are now for the United States is at 106%, which is around $21 trillion of debt. For developing countries, the prudent debt limit is 40% with a debt threshold limit to 60%. And so just for contrast, since 1998, China's public debt has generally remained around the 40% mark. Chart B details the debt after 2008. The blue line represents the debt with quantitative easing measured against nominal GDP. That is represented by the green line. You can barely make it out. The red line, which you can see, is the money supply, which is technically called M2, but also includes liquid assets like savings, CDs, money markets accounts. And the increase, that very slight increase that you see, is seigniorage, or the printing of more money into the monetary base. Now, Chart C, which lines up to Celeste, is the net international investment position measured by a country's balance of payments. It specifically addresses foreign direct investment inflows and outflows. So for the U.S., this payment deficit means that we import more goods and services and capital than we export, and we must borrow from other countries to pay for our imports. Hence, our debt pays for consumption instead of investing in future growth. And I think this is perhaps where I might have a disagreement, with Celeste in terms of where the money comes from in order to pay for our debt. So in the big picture, global investors may generally be less interested in propping up high debt countries like the U.S. and prefer a multipolar system that is more equitable in terms of commodity markets and have better returns for investments of goods and services. So obviously there is much more to this story, which I will touch on later, but right now you might be asking, well, if this were true, then why then do business with the U.S.? And even the U.S. does have a service. There is a service that the U.S. provides, and I think it's quite fair to say that the U.S. is a mercenary country that can sidestep international law simply because we have not ratified a lot of agreements. If the Senate had ratified the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, or Protocols 1 and 2 of the Geneva Convention, or the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, then we might not, be going around the world behaving with such impunity. Next slide, please. So where we are and where we have been for the last decade is in this global economic realignment that is taking place within the G20. The G20 being the 20 largest economies that include both the advanced economies and the emerging economies, who for the most part are aligned with the developing countries. In terms of the international rules of trade and investment, the G20 is really one of the most important forums. Now, in 2009, when Obama joined the TPP, it was fairly clear that creating this trade cooperation was primarily a bully agenda to try to force open China's market. Foreign investment in China had already exacted a lot of damage to the environmental and health standards, and this is something that only recently has China been able to curtail and in some cases reverse. Next slide, please. So here's a before and after picture of a hugely successful reclamation project called the Huangtu, or Celeste Plateau. This was an ambitious project sponsored by the World Bank and China, impacting area about the size of Texas. And anyone interested should familiarize themselves with this project because the scale of this was so vast and so successful that it made me realize that the world could actually potentially reverse global warming. Next slide, please. So in terms of BRICS, what China did was to work with the other emerging economies whose debt thresholds were healthy and relatively stable. In 2014, the leaders signed the Fortaleza Declaration. It's a binding declaration that led to the creation of new multipolar financial institutions like the New Development Bank and the Contingency Reserve Arrangement, alternatives to the World Bank and the IMF. And at its inception, it is a brilliant read because it is a declaration committed to moving away from the unipolarity of the Washington Wall Street agenda and return further back to the multipolar, multilateral UN system. Under BRICS, international development and finance, has been decentralized. With institutions in China, Russia, India, Brazil, and South Africa, the BRICS understood that they could more comprehensively meet the development needs of the various regions than the unipolar development banks that resided in Washington. So after the Fortaleza Declaration was signed, the TPP countries really ramped up their containment policy. So, for example, after Obama launched the Asia-Pacific Rebalance or the Pacific Pivot, Japan changed to Article 9 of their constitution, removing the self-defense clause to allow for more aggressive military campaigns beyond their borders. We also began to see a greater emphasis directed against both China and Russia, particularly around the issue of the South China Sea, which hopefully could be another presentation because that is an issue that is fraught with so much information that it should just be simply classified as a conspiracy. Next slide, please. So whatever you think you might know about the U.S.-led freedom of navigation, it is not dissimilar to the doctrine of expansionism that we find in the Monroe Doctrine. The freedom of navigation has always been a really vague policy intersecting commercial maritime rights with what British Foreign Minister Grey called belligerent rights. And this policy is made even more convoluted considering that China has never impeded in shipping lanes. There have been skirmishes over fishing rights and exploration licenses all around the South China Seas, but those conflicts involve all the countries in the region, not just China. The international law that you often hear about China breaking is also kind of a bogus court case taking place without China's presence in the International Court of Arbitrations. And the rules used in this case was not the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, nor the UN Commission on International Trade Law, the governing bodies that are most often tasked with resolving these kinds of disputes. The rules used were other. Quote-unquote other. In what world is other a rule for international jurisprudence, right? So for the U.S., the objective is only to undermine the China-ASEAN Agreement on the Code of Conduct in the South China Sea, which is the rightful regional jurisdiction for resolution dispute so that it can impose its own vague commercial rights with belligerent rights. Earlier this month, right after the CPTPP was signed, hardly a week went by before Japan met with Malaysia, Australia met with Vietnam to further undermine the China-ASEAN Agreement. Additionally, the U.S. and Japan just engaged in war games in the South China Sea with their nuclear aircraft carrier, the USS Carl Vinson, and Trump has expanded the Asia-Pacific rebalance to be the Indo-Pacific region called the Quad. The Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, which will include the regions between Australia, Japan, India, and the U.S. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. So this slide highlights all the places where there are destabilization efforts. Next slide, please. Sorry, I missed the last slide, I think.
Okay. So
this slide are other destabilization efforts. You have Yemen, Ukraine, Syria, Somalia. These are relatively new conflicts that arose after BRICS. And in North Korea, Afghanistan, Iraq, those are all transit points linking the Belt and Road Initiative. With North Korea, the initiative is China's access to the East Sea. So I'm just going to come, right out and say it, that the Belt and Road may very well be the most ambitious development and investment project in the history of the world, and the full court press against China and Russia in both the mainstream and independent media, and this includes many progressive and conservative outlets, reminds me of the witches in Macbeth, speaking absurd incantations all in unison. Next slide, please. So it may be typical of the propaganda machine to spew half-truths, except they are the most powerful and utterly wicked because these incantations are essentially preparing us for war. And there is little we can do about it because the same democratic processes that have put Trump in the White House are the same processes that are providing the overall consent for war. So if you step back, really our journalists are writing double, double, toil and trouble, Putin and she and boil and bubble, or eye of newt and toe of frog, belt and road and tongue of dog. And if it sounds insane, it is. There is no space to actually look at what the objectives are for fair and equitable trade and what globalization justice should mean among and between the advanced economies, the emerging economies, developing countries, particularly in the context of climate change. Even in the Facebook Trade and Globalization Justice Group that many of us here are part of, I'll sometimes provide, some viable non-journalistic evidence, meaning primary documents like treaties, conventions, congressional reports, agreements, etc. None of it really seems to matter. I just end up being called, a China file or Russia file, and this is mostly true in regard to the Russian annexation of Crimea and the disputed territory around the South China Sea. I mean, the point is that these silly journalistic incantations have very real-world consequences, which to me is so crazy because the story of Macbeth is all about ambition and power. And the lessons of its failures have been taught in schools and performed on stages for hundreds of years. So how, as a nation, have we become as gullible as Macbeth when much of the world understands what is happening and, in my opinion, is really just waiting for the madness to implode? There's something wrong when the discourse is so meticulously orchestrated as to remove the voice of actual sanity. Next slide, please. Earlier this week, the Diplomat magazine published an article called Redefining the Belt and Road Initiative. They write, the Belt and Road Initiative is not a route, but a smart power strategy which aims to wrap the entire world, not only Eurasia and Africa, but also Latin America. The problem with this kind of analysis is that it's not like China or the Belt and Road Initiative is cutting in line to be the next unipolar world power. The reality is that the U.S. stepped out of the line. On the one hand, the U.S. could simply not afford to lead the world as it had, and on the other hand, Trump has literally pulled the U.S. out of the line when he pulled the U.S. out of its international commitments. One thing that is not often discussed is that if the U.S. cannot afford to buy it, to buy what it breaks, it cannot afford to lead the world the way that it did. During the post-war and Cold War years, the U.S. had the capacity to prop up and maintain regime change, but I'm not sure we can afford to do that today. In the case of Honduras, Brazil, Argentina, South Africa, I have my doubts whether these U.S.-backed governments will survive a legitimate democratic election, simply because the neoliberal free market privatization schemes are just so damned unpopular. My sense is that this string of coups may well be temporary salves, impediments to slow down the rate with which the world is moving away from unipolar neoliberal policy. If we look at a more extreme perspective, the ever-expanding presidential kill lists and the ongoing destabilization efforts around the world, and I would include our own national context as we saw yesterday in the March for Our Lives protest, the weapons industry has simply created an environment where all we're doing is facilitating a market for guns and security. Our objectives are clearly not designed to stabilize regions with fair and equitable economic policies. All we are doing is fueling the flames of instability. Jeremy Scales reporting over the last few years of how instability is being managed by U.S. secret armies and private military contractors should be self-evident by now to everyone on this call, but the question of why this is being done might not be. Next slide, please. I keep returning to these geographical trade routes because these are the access points for transport. So when we consider that the Silk Road began over 2,000 years ago, I mean, it's not actually even really about the Silk Road, but when we realize that the history of supply chains go back to, the birth of civilization to some degree, maybe we can understand just how historical supply chains informs our geopolitical narrative. For thousands of years, caravans trading across virtually all landscapes provided a level of exchange in markets that grew into multicultural centers where culture, language, and belief systems mixed. But it was the emergence of the European-dominated maritime trade in the 16th century that displaced the land-based transport of goods, and many of the old centers of trade were sidelined when populations moved to centers with maritime access. As colonial powers competed for domination, islands became strategic locales for controlling maritime trade and transit points since they were easy to defend and administer. The technological shift from land to sea advanced the social and economic growth of maritime regions while stagnating innovation in commerce along the land-based routes. So the implications for the Belt and Road are not only confined to the Eurasian landmass, but to Africa, Latin America, the Caribbean, and the Pacific. And as I mentioned before, the U.S. has gone full court press against China's ambitions. And it's important to be clear that what is at stake is clean, renewable energy, smart power, smart transport, next generation 5G telecom, education, health, food security, labor mobility, big data, artificial intelligence, information technology, robotics, all of these, new technologies, many of them even to help with climate change. So, all of these sectors are right now, or will soon be, subject to international agreements and conventions, and that is what is at the heart of these agreements. Are assurances for fair and equitable trade. So when you step back away from the chatter, it's easy to see what countries have ratified what conventions and treaties and what countries haven't. So, when you're looking at what countries have ratified and what haven't, under this rubric of reality, whatever glimmer of light one might think the U.S. possesses, much of the world shines much brighter because, much of the world has signed on to these conventions and treaties, Next slide, please. So it is within, this context that the Belt and Road Initiative steps to the front of the line, altering the geopolitical map. The point is that sustainable, equitable trade does not have to be an oxymoron, and we just have to adjust to that concept, not lead it, not co-opt it, not undermine it, but participate in it in a way that is fair and equitable and ecologically sustainable. The Belt and Road provides that opportunity, and I can say that with some conviction simply because what is written in the Fortaleza Declaration and in the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank's Articles of Agreement are binding commitments to conform with international standards. These are legal documents, and when you consider that World War I was essentially a war waged as a result of broken treaties, we cannot trivialize these agreements. They are not like throwaway opinions concocted by journalists, generating fear and mistrust, no matter how many times it gets repeated. What is happening now with the Belt and Road Initiative is that it is being harmonized with the real development needs from regions and countries that understand their fragility most. And this is what Xi Jinping has been calling win-win. Next slide, please. So, it is we who have to flip the bias of war and engage in this new initiative. We need to ensure that there are checks and balances, appropriate dispute settlements that conform to ILO labor standards, health and environmental standards that can hold corporations, industries, and states accountable. We need a binding mechanism for free, prior, and informed consent. We need global tax reform, a venue to break monopoly power. We need to radically embrace renewable energy, and we need to have the ability to enforce compliance and monitoring across all these sectors. I mean, the laundry list of must-dos are already taking place with a lot of civil society organizations in regional and multilateral conferences. There are so many sectors that we could excel in, but we are not progressing with the kind of infrastructure that the world wants or needs. Next slide, please. Last slide, please. So as new regions of the world are shifting toward more meaningful global change, why are more of us not at the table? It is as if some of the advanced economies want to undermine and sabotage sincere attempts to build a 21st century global economy that is in line with the Sustainable Development Goals that a couple of people have mentioned. Why is it so important? Only to ensure that our neoliberal financial institutions and corporate legal structures continue to lead the way. Power has an expiration date, and it's long past. And I think that is the real lesson of the 2016 election. As it is now, there are a lot of regulatory rules attached to multilateral agreements that many of the participating countries in the Belt and Road have already signed on to. What has been holding the world back is really the United States. And until the witches stop their silly incantations and revise the nonsensical narrative and actually begin to embrace a model of peace and equitable sustainability, we're only going to end up perpetuating our destructive paradigm. Thank you very much.
Well, that was amazing, Arnie. Can you stick with us until after Jan's, and then we'll have a combined Q&A?
Yes, as long as my daughter doesn't bust in the room.
Oh, okay. Oh, well, would you prefer to have a Q&A on your own?
No, I'm here. I'll be present.
Okay, you can always mute your phone, if your daughter is in the room. Thank you so much. That was really great.
Thanks.
Thank you. I would now like to introduce our third speaker, Jan R. Weinberg. Jan is described as an investigative activist. He is the founder of Show Up America, and that is based in Princeton, New Jersey. Show Up America is an organization focused on teaching civic engagement methodology. A long-term peace activist, Jan is currently organizing with the Anti-War Coalition, Divest from the War Machine. Also, No Trump Military Parade and Spring Action 2018. Jan was also proud to have been an active participant with the TPP resistance initiatives, and that's how we got to know Jan. So welcome, Jan.
My pleasure.
Okay.
My appreciation to Trade Justice Alliance for inviting me to participate in today's webinar. And in conclusion, it is no less than a constitutional crisis that through a succession of United States Congresses, in particular the Senate, that they have unethically abdicated their constitutional responsibility regarding war powers, treaty negotiations, and the regulation of international trade, while simultaneously such responsibilities were readily usurped unethically by a succession of American presidents. Next, we will be reviewing contemporary influences of the military-industrial complex on public policy, in particular some of the Obama administration, along with some terminologies for a frame of reference. Hegemony is a political, economic, or military predominance or control of one state over others. The dominant state is known as the hegemon. Historically, there are many, many instances that led to war when a rising power challenges a dominant one. The dominant military force within the Asia-Pacific has been that of the United States. China speaks of their peaceful rise in economic and military prowess, while American politicians speak of keeping China in its place with their military projection of power presence throughout the Indo-Asia Pacific. Peacefully, of course. Next slide, please. Let's explore why Donald Trump is permitted to deal with international trade issues, including the issuance of tariffs, without the consent of Congress. The Commerce Clause, referring to Article 1, Section 8, Clause 3 of the U.S. Constitution, which gives Congress the power to regulate commerce with foreign nations and among the several states with the Indian tribes. Next slide, please. Trade Promotion Authority. From the USTR's website. For more than 30 years, Congress has enacted trade promotion authority laws to guide both Democratic and Republican administrations in pursuing trade agreements. It is my assertion there exists an inherent conflict of interest for the Commander-in-Chief of the United States Armed Forces to negotiate international trade. It was my observation that President Obama demanded that Congress grant him Trade Promotion Authority, TPA, also known as Fast Track. after extended machinations, horse trading, and legalized bribery in 2015, Congress granted TPA for a 6-year period. Surprise, Trump became president and had the use of trade promotion authority. I personally discussed this issue with Michael Froman, who was Obama's United States Trade Representative. Froman informed me that Congress could pass a bill to rescind trade promotion authority. Given what the majority of congresspersons looked the other way when Obama was negotiating international trade agreements prior to first having obtained TPA in tandem with military alliances and arms deals, well then, they cannot really complain much now, or can they? Next. Tariffs. Trump called for an analysis of the impact of steel and aluminum imports. With a stretch of the definition of national security, Secretary of Commerce Wilbur Ross cited Section 232, Safeguarding National Security of the Trade Expansion Act of 1962, as the legal justification for Trump to issue steel and aluminum tariffs. We should inquire if members of Congress in a court of law can or will legally challenge this action. The problem is that Congress does not want to regulate international trade, as is their constitutional responsibility. It's their job description, if you will. It would take way too much time away from fundraising. Next. The military-industrial complex. In the words of President Eisenhower, in the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influences, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The contemporary military-industrial complex is comprised of campaign contributors, foundation donors, and the promises of the revolving door made by the armament industry corporations and their associated lobbyists, the members of the National Security Council, the State Department, the Department of Commerce, the Commander-in-Chief of the United States Armed Forces, the Senate and House of Representatives, governors, state legislators, media outlets that accept advertising revenue from the armament industry, a wide variety of think tanks, certain institutions of higher education, as well as shareholders and stakeholders within the defense, aerospace, armament market sector. I apologize to those who I may have inadvertently left out. Next.
Should I switch the slide now?
Next slide, please.
Okay.
My take on quagmire theory. One seemingly harmless, misguided step after another. Unintentional mistakes lead us into war and the resulting devastation. Politicians taking advice from those who have self-aggrandizing motivations away from the public purview. Did the Obama administration think it through and anticipate the outcome of the Pivot to Asia initiatives? I doubt it. Next slide, please. How do I know that the Trans-Pacific Partnership became an integrated aspect of the Obama administration's pivot to Asia? From Secretary of Defense Ashton Carter. As President Obama has said, and as I've made repeatedly clear, TPP also makes strong strategic sense as a critical piece of our rebalance toward the Asia Pacific. From Hillary Clinton's Assistant Secretary of State, Kurt Campbell, the TPP is a cardinal priority and a cornerstone of the pivot to Asia. Next slide, please. From National Security Advisor Susan Rice, referring to Hillary Clinton, she was instrumental in formulating and implementing the rebalanced Asia, of which the Trans-Pacific Partnership is a part. And from United States Trade Representative Michael Froman. And TPP was very much part of our rebalancing strategy towards Asia to make sure that the Asia Pacific was really Pacific in character. Next, please. The pivot to Asia. The Obama administration incorporated the Trans-Pacific Partnership, TPP, into a much broader foreign policy initiative known as the Pivot to Asia, later rebranded the Rebalance. The cornerstone militarization aspects of the Pivot to Asia were the sale and gifting of armament systems, the forward deployment of U.S. military assets, as well as enhanced military-to-military exercises throughout the entire Indo-Asia Pacific. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, as the original point person, was instrumental in the promotion of the Pivot to Asia initiatives, including the TPP. Hillary Clinton in 2001, speaking about the Asia Pivot, stated, "We need to be smart and systematic about where we invest time and energy so that we put ourselves in the best position to sustain our leadership, secure our interests, and advance our values. One of the most important tasks of American statecraft over the next decade will therefore be to lock in substantial increased investment, diplomatic, economic, strategic, and otherwise, in the Asia-Pacific region." Translation: strategic is military. The question that has not been brought forth by politicians or media for public discussion is, did the Chinese government view the Obama administration's Pivot to Asia initiatives as measures to contain China? Next, please. Projection of power. From Kirk Campbell in 2010. The region is also home to strategic choke points for global commerce, emerging power centers that will have profound implications for U.S. and international interest, and a foundation for American power projection in the greater Asia Pacific. Next slide, please. Promoting our values. From Hillary Clinton in 2010, America's engagement in the Asia Pacific. Everywhere we go, we will advance one overarching set of goals to sustain and strengthen American leadership in the Asia-Pacific region and to improve security, heighten prosperity, and promote our values. Honestly, I personally do not share Hillary Clinton's concept of values, and I have to wonder what percentage of the 4.5 billion people in Asia if they do. Next. Strategic. The command priorities of Admiral Harris, commander of the U.S. Pacific Command. Defend the homeland, be ready to fight tonight, lead the rebalance. Next slide, please. Statement by President Obama in 2015 on the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Obama said over and over, "We cannot let countries like China write the rules." I would imagine that was taken as an insult. We cannot let countries like China write the rules. Right. Obama didn't even let the American people write the rules on free and fair trade. He left that up to the corporations. That is the quagmire theory in action. Next. Obama's President Export Council. The President's Export Council serves as the principal National Advisory Committee on International Trade. The Council advises the President of government policies and programs that affect U.S. trade performance. This is very important. Next slide, please. The Business Roundtable is an association of chief executive officers of leading U.S. companies, which includes armament industry corporations, Boeing, Caterpillar, GE, General Dynamics, Honeywell, Huntington Ingalls, Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman, and Raytheon, working to promote a thriving economy and expand opportunity for all Americans through sound trade policy. Next. According to the fastidious research conducted by the Center for Responsive Politics, accessible through their website, opensecrets.org, we can see that the Business Roundtable is a lobbying organization. What was it in 2017? 27 million. Next, please. The direct influences of armament industry corporate executives on international trade policy. President Obama assigned James McNerney, who was the president and CEO of Boeing at the time, to serve as the chairman of the President's Export Council, while McNerney was simultaneously the chairman of the Business Roundtable. Marilyn Houston, president and CEO of Lockheed Martin, a member of the Business Roundtable, was also assigned by President Obama to serve as a member of the President's Export Council. There you have it, folks. The unwarranted influences of the military-industrial complex was actually sought by an American president. What advice did Lockheed Martin and Boeing, two of the largest arms manufacturers, give to President Obama related to trade policies. Next. It was the networking efforts of the Business Roundtable and the Chamber of Commerce through their Trade Benefits America coalition that was designed to serve the interests of the rich and powerful elite, of which the TPP resistance was up against. We prevailed, at least temporarily. Next slide, please. The TPP began. It is significant that China was not welcome to have a seat at the TPP negotiating table. Point being that if we do not as a nation embark on the policy to learn, along with Russia and China, to transition to peacetime economies, then the concept of mutually assured destruction will be just that. I'm of the opinion that it's irrelevant to spend much time on who started it. The tit-for-tat arms escalation through the entire Indo-Asia-Pacific region should certainly serve as a cataclysmic warning, and yet it does not. As we were exclaiming, the TPP was NAFTA on steroids. Similarly, the pivot to Asia has been perceived as provocations by imperial America, the quagmire. Next. Despite unequivocal and continuous admonitions from the governments of China and North Korea, the United States elaborated strategic cooperation agreements with Australia, Cambodia, India, Indonesia, Japan, Malaysia, New Zealand, Singapore, Taiwan, Thailand, and Vietnam, including the deployment of the THAAD missile systems to South Korea, $1.83 billion in arms sales to Taiwan, support of Japan's Prime Minister Shinzo Abe's push to reinterpret Article 9 of the Japanese Constitution, which previously prohibited Japan's military engagement, regardless of the protests in Japan, the lifting of the U.S. arms embargo against Vietnam, the expansion of U.S. military bases in the Philippines, forward-deployed strategic military assets, and enhanced war exercises with numerous nations within the region, all pre-planned militarization aspects of Obama's pivot to Asia, which from the point of view of the defense contractors served their business interests perfectly well. And yes, U.S. Special Operations Forces have also been assisting the Philippines military battle Islamic militants in Marawi. Next, please. For a majority of its 550-mile length, the shipping lane, the Strait of Malacca, is approximately 1.7 miles wide. Please notice the proximity to Singapore, which is where U.S. has a naval installation command. The Strait of Malacca is an example of a strategic choke point for global commerce that Kurt Campbell was referring to. Next, please. Strait of Malacca commercial shipping. Despite the difficult shipping markets in 2016, traffic in the world's busiest shipping lane, the Straits of Malacca and Singapore, were up to an all-time high of 80,740 transits. Next, please. Imagine this from the point of view of the Chinese government and the Chinese Liberation Army. From Defense News, India, the Malacca Straits Patrol, and Andaman and Nicobar Command. The Straits of Malacca are considered a weak point in China's maritime strategy, and India wants to assert itself more in such a strategic move as becoming part of the patrol. The move is certainly to upset China. The Malacca Straits Patrol, which has an instrumental effect in controlling piracy, is presently coordinated by the nations of Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, and India. Next, please. The Andaman and Nicobar Island Group, a territory of India, is a strategic naval command. The Department of Defense prominently emphasized India's role in the rebalancing in a 2012 United States Air Force Strategic Study Guide, which states, the U.S.-India strategic partnership has been reaffirmed in the Obama administration's rebalancing or pivot to Asia. The United States' economic and security interests are inextricably linked to developments in the arc extending from the Western Pacific and East Asia to the Indian Ocean regions and South Asia. The guidance study makes it explicit that the United States views India as the southwestern cornerstone of its strategic rebalancing toward Asia. Next slide, please. Where in the world is the U.S. military? Next slide, please. China's One Belt, One Road initiative. From Sun Tzu's The Art of War, which is an ancient Chinese military treatise dating back to the 5th century BC. The supreme art of war is to subdue the enemy without fighting. Next slide, please. China's Djibouti military base. Aside from China's reclamation projects of contested territorial islands, rocks, and atolls, set up its military bases in the South China Sea, China's naval base in Djibouti, thus far, is their only militarization on foreign soil. Thus far. Next slide, please. What can we do? Examine and scrutinize all campaign contributions from the armament industry. I'm adding that to the slide here. We should push for legislative measures and or judicial determinations in order to strip away President's use of tariffs, which is a form of trade regulation. Rescind and then ban future use of trade promotion authority. Prevent U.S. presidents from using nuclear weapons under any circumstance without first obtaining a deliberated declaration of war by Congress, including a commitment for no nuclear first strike. Ratify the United Nations resolution to ban all nuclear weapons. Rescind authority to use rescind authorization to use military force. Review Congress's constitutional responsibilities on a nation-by-nation basis to deliberate and to vote whether or not to engage the military as affirmed by the War Powers Act. I thank you for your time and allowing me to elaborate on my conclusion.
Thank you very much, Jan. That was excellent, as usual. We're going to now open up the mics for people to, if you have a Q&A, if you have a question for Jan or Arnie, please press *6 on your phone, and you'll be prompted to press a 1. You'll be put into the queue. That was really interesting.
Okay, we have our first question already. Good job, audience. Wireless caller at area code 240, your line is open.
Hi, this is Chuck again. I have a question for Arnie. Arnie, you mentioned the idea of taxes, of reforming or going global taxes. In terms of the trillions, I think $32 trillion that is stashed in offshore accounts by kleptocrats and drug lords and the capitalists trying to avoid taxes. What about accessing that, or maybe the Robin Hood tax in terms of trying to fund the SDGs, trying to bring some semblance of global justice to the world?
I think even in terms of taxation, there is a new policy that a lot of the countries have signed on, although typically Trump just pulled itself out of, and it's a trade tax and trade tax policy. I'm trying to remember what it's called. Anyway, I'll get back to it. But anyway, there is out of the G20, there did grow a new international tax policy for the extractive industries, and it's all based upon these sort of like new transparency initiatives. Oh, it's called EITI, the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, and I think it may be worth looking into, because here's like a really great example of how a global tax regime is able to or how a lot of developing countries as well as developed countries can conform to a new kind of global tax transparency and trade initiative. And it's I highly recommend you look at it. EITI.
Thank you.
80.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Arnie. Our next question comes from caller at area code 360. Your line is open.
Hi, this is a question for anyone that can answer it. I always wonder, since most American companies make their products in China and they're considered to be imported, is that an American import or export? To me, it's imperialism. I mean, that we go there and use the cheap labor and then bring the stuff back here.
I think that's a little bit of a loaded question in the sense that a lot of parts are made elsewhere, and the fact that they're as soon as they touch American soil, then they're assembled, then it becomes a made in the you can put the made in the U.S. Sticker on it. So when you look at the history, sort of at the archaeology of shoes, like, is that the right term? Anyway, there's a really great video that showed the entire supply chain process of shoemaking in order to have these shoes made in the United States. And so yes, it does. It on the one hand, it does provide for a lot of labor in other countries, but on the other hand, it also abuses a lot of those the privileges of being there and doing business and getting shoes made. Yeah.
Thanks.
I think Celeste. I feel like Celeste could really speak on that so much better than I could.
I don't know if Celeste, are you still on the line? I'm not sure if she is or not.
It looks like she is.
Okay.
Oh, there you go. Okay.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. So it's counted, just like Arnie says, it's counted as an import. Although if you look at China's numbers, they count their imports of other parts. So this is one of the big things they're saying in NAFTA. Well, it doesn't really matter where they make anything, because if we import a car from Mexico, we've maybe exported to Mexico a lot of parts that go into that car. Well, but those are already counted as exports. So if you're looking for the trade balance, that's already counted. Look out for one thing that these companies, these so-called U.S. companies, are trying to do, because they want to play off this nationalism that people have, or this pride in made in America. They would like the Department of Commerce to start counting them as quote-unquote factoryless goods producers. Factoryless goods producers. So that a company like Apple, which sells a lot of products here in the U.S., but at this moment doesn't produce anything in the U.S., that at some point, once you would count the manufacturing that happens in China as a service rather than a good, and it would really change the U.S. numbers, so you'd have a lot more skewed vision of what's really happening. Now, if you get to a point where you've got a global progressive economy and you have international labor rights respected everywhere and you've got all kinds of things, some of this doesn't matter anymore. But when you're looking at how these companies are trying to take advantage, no matter where they operate, they're taking advantage in developed countries, they're taking advantage in developing countries, then you don't really want to support game playing with the numbers. You want to use numbers that are real, but then understand them the way that Arnie just described what they really mean.
Thank you. Yes.
Thanks, Diane.
Yeah. Thanks, Celeste.
All right. Our next question comes from Alan. Alan, your line is open.
Hi. I just wanted to ask the same question that I asked Celeste. This is Alan speaking from British Columbia. I'm just wondering if either of you may know of anybody or any group that's wanting to get health policy put at the top of the trade agenda, and if you may know of any groups that are wanting to do any kind of networking project for April 7th, World Health Day.
Arnie, are you about?
I am, but I'm sorry. I don't know of any organization that would do that other than some pharmaceutical company. But that's probably not the right agenda.
Well, what I'm looking for are people who want to get the public interest on top of the pharmaceutical policy development question. I don't think we should be allowing corporations to control this, because we have an outrageous differential between what for-profit pharmacology companies charge and what worker co-op pharmaceutical manufacturers charge. It's like thousands of % difference.
I do think that there are a lot of international groups and even local national groups. I think like the Roosevelt Initiative, is that what it's the Roosevelt Group, and that do look at, for example, introducing or raising health and environment in trade disputes, right? Or they're just trying to raise its recognition and raise its viability alongside businesses and other investors. And so I would encourage you to take a look at some of those groups that are calling for that kind of ISDS reform for fair and equitable trade.
I sure will. Thank you.
Health and the environment is obviously, the two big factors that, or health, environment, and labor are the maybe three big factors that need to be represented, have greater representation.
Yeah, I'll get a hold of the Roosevelt Institute.
Thank you. I have a question for Arnie. Since there's no one else in the queue, I'm trying to put it together here. I think most people that have been, working against these large trade agreements for so long are really concerned about just the effects on trade itself, on sea level rise and on global warming. And I was just wondering if maybe how China, with all these agreements with the countries, for example, under the Belt and Road, are they more looking to invest in these clean energy technologies rather than in the countries where they're invested, rather than in doing all these, circuitous trade routes that would increase global warming?
I do think it's purely in terms of how we even approach that question. I think it's very difficult right now because there's very little that we really do know about the Belt and the Belt and Road Initiative in terms of any of its investments. But the thing is in terms of compliance and monitoring, this is something that I think China, as well as the other participating countries, have been really, really good about. So far. We're only speaking about the last 3 years. I'm not speaking about the last 10 years, obviously. And I do think that they've been that so far, since Xi Jinping, that they've been good at participating within the international meetings. And I know that, for example, in Papua New Guinea, it used to be that when China was there, they'd negotiate with the government, and then they would, they'd receive, some plot of huge customary land that they should not have had the right to, and then they would, course, log the place clean, and it was a huge problem. But ever since the Belt and Road Initiative, they've been consulting with with many of the customary rights holders of these particular places, particular forested areas, and I think that in itself has really begun to sort of change the image. I don't think that's necessarily resulted in the fact that China has stopped logging in these areas, but what it has done is it has at least created a dialogue for consultation, which is obviously really, really important. One of the other things that they did, and this is in regard to the Nicaragua Canal, is that when the Nicaragua Canal was being negotiated, a lot of the sort of indigenous peoples heavily protested because the canal was going to go right through their traditional homelands, and so what China did was rerouted the canal, and and to me that's unheard of, and here this is all happening at the same time as the Dakota Access Pipeline protests were going on, where they would not reroute the pipeline, right? And so we really are talking about on the one hand we're talking about image, but we're also talking about whether or not China and the other big investor countries within the Belt and Road Initiative are going to follow these sort of new protocols for trade and investment. And in regard to indigenous peoples, the protocols are free, prior, and informed consent. But of course there's no binding legal agreement as to even what that means as of yet. But at least there is a consent process that's taking place.
The other thing is, I think about, all these big investor companies making all the rules for these tiny little countries, like Hawaii and Guam and all these other little bitty countries that don't seem to have a say about anything. And, I just, that is very worrisome to me, because I see all of these cultures that are just being destroyed, so many indigenous cultures and languages and customs and everything, and ways of life that are basically being homogenized to these great big investors. That is very worrisome to me, and I have to ask if the big countries really care about that at all. So is there any effort to take that into consideration?
I do
indigenous
think that
peoples, the indigenous peoples of the Pacific region, are there wishes?
Well, there is. I do think that unfortunately, well, maybe fortunately, there is the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples that was signed in 2007, and and so the this notion, of free, prior, and informed consent, is really central to indigenous peoples to be able to say yes or no, to projects, or to how they want to engage with the investment regime, and within the UN the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, within this grouping, you've got you have the Pacific group, you've got the North American group, the South American group, the African group, so forth and so on. And so within these groupings, there's a tremendous amount of discussion, that has been going on over the last, decade or so, in regard to what this means with international investment. And I think it's important to realize that, not all indigenous peoples are, the same, and that many indigenous peoples would welcome, international investment. A lot of indigenous peoples would completely reject it and just, would want to stay as far away of it as possible. But nevertheless, there needs to be a consent process. And this is what is being discussed, at the international forum right now. And and I could speak about this, a little more technically, because there's a big sort of World Bank sponsored event that happened about 2 years ago in Norway, and in many ways it was so divisive that it really sort of put a wedge in the Indigenous Peoples Forum, and it was in regard to it has to do in regard to streamlining free, prior, and informed consent. Like should FPIC be streamlined, or should it stick to this sort of original spirit where individual groups will have a yes or no a vote, so to speak, on these projects, and what is that relationship to the states, because a lot of times Indigenous peoples are not in line with bigger state policy. So this is where things are at, and China is very much at the table, as well as all of the other UN countries. In fact, China signed the UN DRIP long before the United States did. The U.S. still hasn't ratified it. It's just all it did is recognized it, and this happened under Obama. Obama recognized the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples.
Okay, we should.
Harriet.
Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
I just wanted to add. So folks should know that in international law, if something is called a convention, so a convention protecting the rights of people with disabilities or Indigenous peoples, or one of the labor conventions from the ILO. Convention means there's no enforcement mechanism. So really the only enforcement is if parties want to get together and talk about it, or if there's a public shaming factor, but there's no actual adjudication or enforcement mechanism. And so a lot of the rights that are protected internationally, human rights, there's no enforcement mechanism. Conversely, in trade agreements, there are enforcement mechanisms. So there's always state-to-state dispute settlement where if one country thinks another country is violating something there, they can take the other country to an arbitration panel and have it declared if they choose to do that. Or investor state, which is much more common because countries don't really want to challenge each other, because that's why they sign conventions, because it's sort of nice and polite. Investors can go to the arbitration panel and sue a country. And so what happens in practice is you've got a lot of this nice language saying we respect human rights, we respect Indigenous peoples, we respect labor rights, but then a property owner comes and says, aha, but I have a right to build a dam or clear cut a forest or whatever it is. And they will sue to enforce those rights. And so in practice, what you've got generally are guidelines for people, but rules for property owners. And I would say beware, again, of Canada trying to put on this nice face. They've tried to get a lot of publicity, PR, saying they've put forth a proposal to protect Indigenous peoples in the new NAFTA. And if you look at what they put forth, what their chapter on Indigenous peoples was for their agreement with Chile, it was all language about we recognize Indigenous peoples and we respect them and yada yada, but there's not a single thing that's enforceable. So in the end, would it change how either Canada or Chile treated Indigenous peoples and how their rights would be protected more greatly than property owners' rights? No. Legally, there's no difference. So folks just need to beware that this is one of the critical problems when we're trying to say, how these trade agreements work or don't work. A lot of times they'll talk a good game about we respect labor rights, we respect women, we respect whatever, but if those rights can't be vindicated but the rights of, the global capital can be, then in effect you haven't accomplished a whole lot. So I'll stop there.
And the right, the corporatists really these are regulations. These trade agreements are regulations, and basically they're regulating what we can, do, to preserve the planet and human rights. So I just think we ought to try to get rid of these trade agreements. These free trade agreements. They're killing us. So, thanks, Celeste. Thanks, Arnie and Jan. I believe that's all the questions that we have for now. And I thank you both. Both Arnie and Jan's documents are available on our Trade Justice Alliance Facebook group. And additionally, if you want to, Jan has a large document, a PDF file about his research work that he's done on the military-industrial complex and trade, and Arnie has a long history. And Arnie, what's the name of your Facebook group that you oversee? I forget.
Oh, it's the Trade and Globalization Justice. And
you can go there. Go ahead.
Yeah, well, also Celeste is another chunk of it.
Yep. Okay. Well, thank you both so much. It was really great hearing both of you speak. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
You're welcome. Our pleasure. Thank you. So great to hear another perspective. And let's see. I want to just mention real quickly that Trade Justice Alliance is going to host a very short webinar. I promise you, it's only going to be about a half hour long, I believe, and that is going to be on April 15th. 7:30. We are going to have Carl Rosen. He's the president of the Western region of the United Electrical Radio and Machine Workers of America, shortened to UE. And Carl will give a presentation based on the membership's collective analysis of the tariffs, and that is going to be current and a historical labor perspective. They came by this analysis when they met in Chicago on March 9th, and they issued this statement. So we're going to have UE's statement and a Q&A, and that's going to be Sunday, April 15th. So please join us for that. Also, you can access all of our YouTube videos by going to tradejustice.net/webinar vids. Carrie Marks, she runs the call board also. She mixes the audio and the visuals, and she makes YouTube videos, and the big part of our work is promoted after these webinars, and Carrie is responsible for that. So we just love her for doing that for us. So you can access those. And if you're so inclined, folks, we're still looking for people to join our volunteer planning team. We hold these planning calls on Wednesday nights. We need help with people to promote our webinars. That's a big focus for us. Help with our newsletter that we put out. We try to put it out monthly. We need help with ideas for speakers and other things that we haven't even thought of yet. So if you want to join us, our number on Wednesday night is the same number that you dialed in on tonight, and our planning is from 8 o'clock Eastern till about 9 Eastern, so we'd love to have you. And if you'd like to chip in a couple of bucks, we wouldn't turn it down. You can go to tradejustice.net/TJA donate, where we are covered under the Wetlands Activist Collective umbrella, and you can just donate there through PayPal. So thank you so much to our speakers and to all of you. We know that you could be somewhere else tonight on your Sunday evening, so we really appreciate that you chose to spend your time with us. Thank you so much. And thank you so much, everybody. Have a great evening.
Good night, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Chuck, if you're still there, stay on.
Everyone.
Hi, Mara.
Hi, Harriet.